Welcome back to the deep dive. Get ready, because today we are doing exactly what this show is all about, plunging headfirst into a really crucial and frankly, incredibly devastating period of European history. We are tackling the 30 Years' War, and we're going to unpack it using the best tool we have, that stack of source material you, our listener, provided.
Yeah.
You specifically wanted a deep dive into the causes and the context of this massive conflict. And that's our mission today.
Absolutely.
Our goal is to, cut through the complexity, understand the tangled web of reasons why this war started, why it exploded to the scale it did, and what its immense impact truly was. We're going to pull out the most important insights from this material, giving you that shortcut to being genuinely well-informed about a turning point that still resonates today.
And then when we say turning point, we really, really mean it. The material you sent highlights just how significant the 30 Years' War was, describing it as one of the most destructive conflicts in the entire history of the European continent before the modern era. It didn't just rearrange borders, it fundamentally reshaped Central Europe and dramatically altered the balance of power across the continent. And for the timeline we're focusing on today, the 30 Years' War ran specifically from 1618 to 1648.
1618 to 1648. 30 years?
Yeah.
That's a long time for a war. And you might think, okay, it was a war, bad things happened. But the sources make it absolutely clear this wasn't some isolated event with one simple cause.
No, not at all.
It's a convergence of religious fury, deep-seated political rivalries, and structural weaknesses in the very fabric of Europe, all hitting critical mass at just the wrong moment. It's a truly fascinating, albeit horrifying, case study in how complex historical events arise.
It's really.
So let's maybe start by grappling with the sheer scale of the devastation, because the material you shared really drives this home. The numbers are genuinely shocking. We're talking about estimates ranging from 4.5 to potentially 8 million soldiers and civilians who died over those 3 decades.
8 million. It's almost unthinkable.
It really is. And it wasn't just on the battlefield, right?
Yeah.
Sources point out that a huge proportion of these deaths were due to famine and disease, which spread rampantly as armies crisscrossed the land, disrupting agriculture and trade, and, concentrating large numbers of people and their accompanying illnesses.
Exactly. The movement of armies was devastating in itself, even without active fighting sometimes.
And the impact wasn't evenly spread. It was concentrated, particularly in parts of the Holy Roman Empire, which bore the brunt of the fighting for long stretches. The material mentions areas within what is now Germany, where the population decreased by over 50%.
50%.
50%. That's not just a statistic. That's the loss of entire generations in some places. The complete collapse of social structures, villages abandoned, farms ruined. It was a level of lived horror that's almost impossible for us today to fully comprehend. It wasn't quick battlefield deaths for most. It was slow starvation, sickness, displacement.
Putting that scale into context is vital to understanding the 30 Years' War, and the material you provided is excellent for this, as it lists several contemporary or related conflicts. This isn't just trivia. It shows us that the 30 Years' War wasn't some unique anomaly.
Right.
It was deeply interconnected with and happening alongside a whole series of other major crises and wars raging across Europe and even globally at the time. It reveals the incredibly turbulent landscape of the early 17th century.
Okay, so what else was going on?
Well, for instance, the material draws a direct connection to the 80 Years' War, also known as the Dutch Revolt.
Ah, yes.
This conflict, which ran from around 1566 or 1568, also concluded in 1648, the same year as the Peace of Westphalia that ended the 30 Years' War.
Same end date. Interesting.
Exactly. This war was fought in the Netherlands between various groups of rebels and the Spanish government. The sources you provided outline several causes: the impact of the Reformation leading to religious tension with Catholic Spain, the Spanish government's push for greater centralization, which clashed with local traditions, excessive taxation imposed by Spain, and issues surrounding the long-standing rights and privileges of the Dutch nobility and cities.
So religious, political, economic factors all mixed together there too.
Precisely. And because Spain was a major player in the 30 Years' War, their entanglement in this long, draining conflict right on the border of the Holy Roman Empire directly impacted their resources and strategic priorities within the empire. They were fighting on multiple fronts.
Makes sense. What else?
Then there's the War of the Mantuan Succession, which the sources explicitly link to the 30 Years' War, fought from 1628 to 1631.
Mantuan succession.
Yeah. The spark here was the death of the last male heir of the House of Gonzaga in Mantua and Montferrat in December 1627. These territories in northern Italy were strategically crucial, sitting along key routes.
Location, location, location.
Always. As the material explains, the vacuum in power quickly turned into a proxy war between rival claimants, the Duke of Nevers, backed by France, and the Duke of Guastalla, supported by Spain.
Ah, France versus Spain again, but playing out in Italy.
Exactly. You can see how quickly a seemingly regional dispute in Italy pulled in the major European powers who were already on opposing sides in the broader continental tensions that would define the 30 Years' War.
It's like a web.
It really is. The Franco-Spanish War, running from 1635 all the way to 1659, is also highlighted. The material you sent notes that the first phase of this war, from 1635 to 1648, is considered part and parcel of the 30 Years' War, ending with the Peace of Westphalia.
So that phase aligns perfectly.
It does. This shows how the conflict within the Holy Roman Empire eventually became a theater for the long-standing rivalry between Bourbon France and Habsburg Spain. The second phase continued after Westphalia, illustrating that while one major conflict ended, others persisted.
Right, the underlying rivalries didn't just disappear in 1648.
Not at all. Another concurrent war mentioned is the Torstenson War, fought between Sweden and Denmark-Norway between 1643 and 1645, named after the Swedish general Lennart Torstenson.
Okay, a Nordic conflict.
Yes, and this conflict occurred late in the 30 Years' War and was part of the broader regional power struggle in the Baltic and Northern Europe, involving powers who were also key actors in the war within the Holy Roman Empire. Sweden, Denmark, they were deeply involved. It shows how interconnected the military theaters of Europe were at this time.
Multiple chessboards all moving at once.
You could say that. Moving further afield, the sources mention the Dutch-Portuguese War, which began much earlier, in 1598. This wasn't just a European affair. It was a global conflict involving Dutch trading companies, primarily the formidable Dutch East India Company and Dutch West India Company, and their allies.
The big trading company, yeah.
Fighting against the Iberian Union, Spain and Portugal were united under the Spanish Habsburgs from 1580 to 1640, and later, after 1640, the restored Portuguese Empire. The material points out that this conflict largely involved Dutch companies invading Portuguese colonies in places as far-flung as the Americas, Africa, and the East Indies.
Wow, so this really stretched globally.
It did. And while not directly in Central Europe, it's critical because it shows the global reach of the Spanish Habsburgs and how their resources were stretched across multiple continents, impacting their ability to project power and fund their allies within the Holy Roman Empire.
They were spread thin.
Very thin. Finally, the Portuguese Restoration War, also known as the War of Acclamation, which began in 1640 and lasted until 1668. This war was fought between Portugal and Spain, kicking off with the Portuguese Revolution in 1640 that ended 60 years of Spanish Habsburg rule over Portugal, the Iberian Union.
So Portugal breaks away.
Yes, and this revolt and subsequent war forced Spain to divert significant military and financial resources to defend its control over the Iberian Peninsula and suppress the Portuguese rebellion. This directly impacted Spain's ability to support the Austrian Habsburgs and their Catholic allies in the 30 Years' War, particularly after 1640.
Another major drain on Spanish resources right when things were heating up elsewhere.
Exactly. What this whole list from your sources underscores is that the 30 Years' War didn't happen in a vacuum. It was a major part of a wider, deeply unstable, and interconnected geopolitical landscape. Powers were fighting on multiple fronts in multiple regions for a variety of reasons: religious, dynastic, economic, and strategic.
It's not just one story.
No. These simultaneous conflicts weren't just background noise. They drained resources, created alliances, and directly influenced the course and scale of the fighting within the Holy Roman Empire. It was a truly turbulent era, where crises in one area quickly became entwined with conflicts elsewhere.
It really makes you pause and think, doesn't it? We often look at wars in isolation, but this material shows us how crucial it is to see them as part of a larger system. Think about how conflicts today, whether, regional proxy wars or global economic rivalries, are deeply interconnected. A crisis in one part of the world can quickly draw in multiple actors and affect seemingly unrelated situations elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
This interconnectedness of global and regional conflicts is absolutely not a new thing. It was fundamental to understanding something as complex as the 30 Years' War.
Very true.
Okay, let's really dig into the deep roots, the fundamental origins of this conflict, as highlighted in the material you sent. One of the primary origins pointed to is the Protestant Reformation.
Can't avoid it.
No. This wasn't just a minor theological dispute. It was a seismic movement within 16th century Western Christianity that mounted a significant, multifaceted challenge to the authority of the papacy and the established Catholic Church. It marked, of course, the beginning of Protestantism as a major branch of Christianity.
A fundamental split.
And the key event that kicked it all off, according to the sources, was Martin Luther publishing his 95 Theses in 1517. This act, often cited as the start of the Reformation, gave rise to Lutheranism. And the material you shared even mentions that some historians see this event as a marker for the transition from the Middle Ages to the early modern period in Europe. That's how profoundly it changed things.
It really did reshape the landscape, and this profound split in Western Christianity didn't just stay theological, it quickly spilled into open conflict, particularly within the fragmented political landscape of the Holy Roman Empire.
Right, the HRE.
The sources mention that by the mid-16th century, open warfare had erupted between Protestants and Catholics within the HRE. This period of conflict was eventually brought to a temporary halt by the Peace of Passau in 1552.
Okay, a temporary stop.
Temporary is the key word. Following the Peace of Passau, the Peace of Augsburg was signed in 1555 between the Emperor Charles V and the Schmalkaldic League, which was an alliance of Lutheran princes. The stated purpose of the Peace of Augsburg, as the material emphasizes, was to officially end the religious struggle between these two groups and, critically, to make the legal division of Christianity within the Holy Roman Empire a permanent reality.
Trying to draw a line under it.
Exactly. The core principle established by this treaty was the famous cuius regio, eius religio, a Latin phrase meaning whose realm, his religion.
Whose realm, his religion.
Okay. What this meant in practice was that the ruler of each individual state or territory within the Holy Roman Empire had the right to choose the official religion for their domain. Their subjects were expected to follow that religion, or in some cases, were given the option to emigrate. The choices officially recognized by the treaty were Lutheranism and Roman Catholicism, based on the ruler's own faith.
So, just those two, Lutheran and Catholic.
Just those two were officially recognized by Augsburg, yes. The material also notes other provisions, such as offering some protection to significant religious minorities within certain imperial cities, using Donauwörth as an example, and confirming the ownership of church property seized by Lutherans before 1552.
So on the surface, quis regio eius religio sounds like a pragmatic solution. Let the rulers decide, keep the peace. But the material you sent us makes it clear that this peace was fundamentally unstable and didn't last. It was, in fact, destabilized.
It absolutely was. It contained the seeds of its own failure, in a way.
How so? What destabilized it?
Well, the destabilization came because Protestantism didn't stop expanding after 1555, and crucially, a new factor emerged: the rise of Calvinism.
Ah, okay. The third major branch.
Exactly. The Peace of Augsburg only recognized Lutheranism and Catholicism. Calvinism, another major branch of the Reformation originating with John Calvin, began to gain followers within the Holy Roman Empire after 1555, and the material you provided highlights a critical point about Calvinism. It was viewed with hostility by both established groups, Lutherans and Catholics.
So Calvinists weren't covered by the peace seal, and nobody liked them.
Pretty much. So not only did Protestantism spread geographically into areas where it wasn't officially recognized by Augsburg, but a powerful new form of Protestantism emerged that fell completely outside the framework of the 1555 agreement. This created new, deep divisions and tensions that the existing peace mechanism had no way to resolve.
Okay, that sounds like a recipe for trouble.
And this is where the religious differences became inextricably linked with political power. As the sources point out, religious differences combine powerfully with fundamental disagreements over the actual limits of imperial authority within the Holy Roman Empire.
Right, power struggles.
For many princes, adopting Protestantism wasn't just a matter of faith, it was also a way to assert their independence from the Catholic emperor and the authority of the Catholic Church. Religion became a banner under which political objectives could be pursued.
Using religion for political gain.
It happens. The material clearly states that while religion was a significant factor in triggering the war, providing that deep-seated ideological divide and a ready source of antagonism and alliance, its ultimate scope and devastating scale were, to a large extent, a consequence of external factors.
Okay, so religion is the fuel, but not the whole fire.
Exactly. Specifically, the intense, long-standing rivalry between France and the Habsburgs, and the ongoing struggle with the Dutch revolt. This is a crucial insight the sources provide. The war wasn't just a religious war in isolation. Religious tensions were the volatile fuel, yes, but the existing political landscape of major power rivalries provided the oxygen and the spark that turned it into a continent-wide inferno. The great powers used religious differences as a pretext and a means to pursue their own strategic ends.
That makes a lot of sense. The context is everything.
It really is. Now let's shift our focus slightly to the structural issues within the Holy Roman Empire itself, because the sources emphasize that the very nature of the empire made it incredibly difficult to resolve these religious and political differences peacefully. The material you provided describes the HRE as fundamentally fragmented.
Fragmented, how so?
And the description is striking. We're talking about not one unified country, but a patchwork of around 300 imperial domains scattered across vast swaths of Central Europe.
300. Wow.
Including present-day Germany, the Netherlands, parts of northern Italy, and sections of what is now eastern France. These domains were incredibly varied in size, power, and status. They ranged from the most powerful entities, the 7 prince-electors who held the unique right to elect the Holy Roman Emperor.
Okay, the electors.
Down through prince-bishops, church leaders who also held secular ruling power over territories, to numerous counts, dukes, knights, and independent imperial cities like Hamburg. Each of these entities possessed a significant degree of autonomy and held specific rights and privileges relative to the emperor and the empire as a whole. It was incredibly complicated.
A real patchwork quilt of power.
That's a good way to put it. The material also mentions the imperial circles. These were regional groupings of territories within the empire, initially created primarily for defense and to maintain order. But over time, they also developed their own institutions and operated with considerable independence, often acting as blocks of power within the larger imperial structure.
So even the internal groupings were semi-independent.
Right. And overseeing this complex, multi-layered system was the imperial diet, the legislative assembly of the empire. But the sources tell us the diet met only rarely and, crucially, functioned more as a forum for discussion and negotiation among the princes and representatives of the cities than as an effective body for passing and enforcing binding legislation across the entire empire.
More talk than action, maybe.
Often, yes. What this adds up to, and what the material clearly shows, is a political structure with weak central institutions, multiple competing power centers, and deeply entrenched regional autonomy. Trying to implement any kind of unified policy, especially on contentious issues like religion or taxation, was an immense challenge.
Sounds almost impossible to govern effectively.
It was incredibly difficult.
And within this fragmented structure, the most powerful players were the House of Habsburg.
The big dynasty.
While the position of Holy Roman Emperor was technically elective, the sources note that the title had been held by the Habsburg family almost continuously since 1440. They weren't just emperors, they were also the largest landowners within the HRE, directly ruling over a vast population of over 8 million subjects in their hereditary lands.
Huge holdings.
Which included the Archduchy of Austria and the kingdoms of Bohemia and Hungary.
Yeah, Austria, Bohemia, Hungary core Habsburg lands.
What's also crucial, as the sources highlight, is the strong connection between the Austrian Habsburgs and the Spanish Habsburgs. The Emperor Charles V, who dealt with the early Reformation and the Peace of Augsburg, had ruled a combined vast empire encompassing both the Holy Roman Empire lands and the massive Spanish Empire.
Right. Charles V had it all for a time.
When he divided his possessions in 1556, it created 2 distinct branches, but the ties remained incredibly strong, reinforced by frequent interfamily marriages. And critically, the Spanish Habsburgs retained important territories within the geographical area of the Holy Roman Empire or immediately adjacent to it, which were strategically vital.
Still had skin in the game, so to speak.
Exactly. These included the Spanish Netherlands, roughly modern-day Belgium and Luxembourg, the Duchy of Milan in northern Italy, and the region of Franche-Comté near the border with France. These territories meant the Spanish Habsburgs were constantly invested in the affairs of the HRE.
Which raises a fascinating point that the sources address directly. With such close family ties and shared interests, did the 2 branches of the Habsburgs operate with a single unified policy?
You'd think maybe they would coordinate closely.
You might think so, but the material is quite clear on this. It states there was not a common policy between the Austrian and Spanish branches.
Really? Why not?
And the reasons, as outlined, are rooted in their different focuses. The Spanish Habsburgs were, as the material describes them, a global maritime superpower. Their empire stretched across Europe, Asia, the Philippines, and the vast Americas. Their priorities were defending their global trade routes, managing their colonial possessions, and maintaining their status as the preeminent power in Europe and beyond.
A global perspective.
Very much so. The Austrian Habsburgs, in contrast, were fundamentally a land power. Their primary focus was centered on their extensive lands in Central Europe, managing their diverse subjects in Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary, and, crucially, defending their eastern frontier against the constant and significant threat posed by the expansionist Ottoman Empire.
Facing east toward the Ottomans.
Exactly. These different strategic priorities naturally led to different policy objectives, even if they were closely related by blood.
Different problems, different priorities.
And another critical distinction the sources highlight was the financial relationship. The Spanish Habsburgs, drawing wealth from their global empire, provided significant subsidies to the Austrian Habsburgs.
The money flowed from Spain to Austria.
Largely, yes. These payments were vital for the Austrian branch, whose resources, while substantial, were often strained by the costs of governance, maintaining armies, and defending against the Ottomans. And that money, really important. The material points out a key implication: the loss of these crucial Spanish subsidies, particularly after 1640.
When Spain got bogged down in the Portuguese War and others.
Precisely. When Spain itself was heavily involved in costly wars, that loss of funds significantly weakened the imperial position of the Austrian Habsburgs. It limited their ability to raise and fund armies and project authority within the empire.
So Spain's problems directly weakened the emperor in Germany.
Directly. It shows that interconnectedness again.
Okay, so let's layer these factors together from the sources. You have the deep religious divide ignited by the Reformation and exacerbated by Calvinism's rise, a challenge the Peace of Augsburg couldn't handle.
Check.
This is built on top of a fundamentally weak and fragmented political structure in the Holy Roman Empire, with hundreds of semi-autonomous entities and ineffective central institutions.
Check.
And then you have the ruling Habsburg dynasty, incredibly powerful in theory, but internally divided by geography and strategic focus, and with the Austrian branch relying financially on their globally stretched Spanish cousins.
A complex picture.
The material makes a really insightful point here. Before the Reformation, a shared, albeit sometimes contested, Catholicism provided a unifying force across the HRE that partly compensated for the weakness of the imperial institutions.
Sort of religious glue. Yeah.
Even with all the fragmentation, there was a common religious identity that bound many together, or at least provided a common framework. But after 1556, with the permanent legal division of Christianity and rising religious and political tensions, that unifying force was gone. This weakness in institutions became a major problem.
The cracks really started to show then.
It created a power vacuum, or, perhaps more accurately, allowed stronger regional states, like the explicitly mentioned Lutheran Saxony and Catholic Bavaria, to expand their own power and pursue independent policies more aggressively. This rise of powerful, independent-minded regional states further eroded the already limited authority of the Holy Roman Emperor and the central imperial institutions.
So the weaker the center got, the stronger some regions became. And this internal struggle within the Holy Roman Empire was constantly influenced and often exacerbated, as the sources describe, by external powers with their own distinct strategic objectives.
Right, the outsiders looking in.
Powers like Spain, who, as we mentioned, still held territory within the HRE and were the dominant global power. The Dutch Republic, engaged in a decades-long war for independence against Spain and deeply concerned about Spanish and imperial power on their border. And France, who, under the Bourbon dynasty, was determined to counter the power of the encircling Habsburgs, both Austrian and Spanish, on multiple fronts.
France feeling squeezed by Habsburgs on all sides.
Exactly. These external powers saw the internal tensions and fragmentation of the HRE as an opportunity to weaken their rivals, expand their own influence, or secure their borders.
Meddling for strategic advantage.
And here's a critical detail from the sources that facilitated this external intervention. A significant number of foreign rulers also held titles and territories within the Holy Roman Empire.
Ah, that's key.
It really is. This wasn't just international meddling. It gave rulers from outside the empire a direct, legitimate reason, based on their status as imperial princes, to get involved in what might otherwise have been purely internal imperial disputes. It provided a legal and political hook for intervention.
So they weren't entirely outsiders.
Not technically, in some cases. The sources give the clear example of Christian V of Denmark. When he entered the war in 1625, he didn't do so just as the King of Denmark. He intervened specifically in his capacity as the Duke of Holstein-Gottorp, a territory located within the Holy Roman Empire.
So he was wearing two hats, kind of. King of Denmark and Duke within the HRE.
Precisely. This dual status meant that a war within the HRE could quickly become a war involving Denmark, Sweden, and other foreign powers wearing their imperial prince hats.
Okay, that explains how external powers got drawn in so directly. So you have this volatile mix, religious conflict boiling over from the Reformation, a fundamentally weak and fragmented political structure in the Holy Roman Empire, a powerful but divided ruling dynasty, ambitious regional states vying for more power, and external powers with their own agendas, who had a legal reason to intervene because they held titles within the empire.
A powder keg.
Exactly. The sources point to a specific moment that acted as the immediate trigger, the spark that ignited this powder keg into open warfare in 1618.
The flashpoint.
That event was the Bohemian Revolt. Specifically, it began with the act of defiance against the Catholic Habsburg ruler, Emperor Ferdinand II. Ferdinand was also the king of Bohemia, a crucial territory for the Austrian Habsburgs. The revolt escalated when the Protestant Bohemian estates, rebelling against Habsburg authority and fearing a rollback of their religious freedoms, replaced Ferdinand as their king with the Protestant Frederick V of the Palatinate in August 1619.
A direct challenge, deposing the Habsburg king.
A direct, high-stakes challenge to Habsburg control in a vital part of their hereditary lands.
And, according to the sources, the initial Bohemian revolt was suppressed relatively quickly by the imperial forces and their allies. The Battle of White Mountain in 1620 was a decisive victory for the emperor.
So it could have ended there.
It could have, perhaps. It led to the re-establishment of Catholic Habsburg control over Bohemia and severe repression against the Protestant nobility there. However, Frederick V's involvement wasn't contained to Bohemia. As Elector Palatine, his actions extended the conflict to his home territory, the Lower Palatinate, situated along the strategic Rhine River.
Ah, so Frederick, being the Elector Palatine, dragged that region in too.
Exactly. And the sources emphasize the Palatinate's strategic importance. It controlled key communication routes and was located adjacent to the Spanish Netherlands and other Spanish territories.
Okay, so its location was critical.
Absolutely. This strategic location immediately drew in major external players, specifically the Dutch Republic and Spain, who were already locked in their own ongoing 80 Years' War. The conflict in the Palatinate became another front in that larger struggle, linking the dynamics of the Dutch Revolt directly into this escalating conflict within the Holy Roman Empire.
So the Spanish saw an opportunity to connect their territories.
Right, the famous Spanish Road. They saw an opportunity to secure a vital route connecting their territories in Italy to the Netherlands, while the Dutch saw a threat to their borders and a potential ally in Frederick V.
Okay, so the Palatinate becomes a new battleground for Spain and the Dutch.
And then that point about imperial titles comes back into play.
Right. Remember how we discussed the crucial detail from the sources about external powers holding titles within the empire? This became even more relevant as the conflict expanded beyond Bohemia and the Palatinate. The sources explain how rulers like Christian IV of Denmark, whom we've mentioned, and Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden had acquired territories within the Holy Roman Empire, particularly in northern Germany.
Yeah, gaining footholds.
These acquisitions, often made earlier or consolidated during the war, gave them a direct, vested interest and a strategic foothold that provided a legitimate reason to intervene in imperial affairs, beyond just supporting fellow Protestants or countering Habsburg power from the outside. Their status as imperial princes gave them standing to act within the empire's political framework.
So it wasn't just about religion, it was about their own lands within the empire being potentially affected.
Exactly. Combine this with the growing, widespread fear among Protestant states across Europe that the resurgent Catholic Habsburg power, emboldened by victory in Bohemia, posed a fundamental threat to the safety and survival of the Protestant religion in general. The sources connect these threads together powerfully.
Yes, the sources clearly state that the acquisition of territories within the empire by foreign rulers, which gave them a cause for intervention, combined with the widespread fears for the safety of Protestantism across Europe, transformed what began, according to the material, as an internal dynastic dispute over the Bohemian succession into a much wider European conflict.
So you see how it snowballed.
Absolutely. The local spark in Prague found ready fuel in the existing religious divisions, structural weaknesses of the empire, Habsburg ambitions, and the strategic interests of external powers who could intervene legally through their imperial titles. It wasn't just one thing. It was the dangerous intersection of all these factors that caused the fire to spread uncontrollably across the continent.
A perfect storm, really.
A devastatingly perfect storm. The sources then generally outline the phases of the war, highlighting how its nature changed over time. The period from 1618 to roughly 1635 is largely characterized as primarily a civil war within the Holy Roman Empire.
Okay, the first phase. Internal HRE conflict.
Right. This phase saw the emperor, supported by Catholic states like Bavaria and the Spanish Habsburgs, fighting against various Protestant states and alliances within the empire, with external powers like Denmark and Sweden intervening. Often wearing their imperial prince hats, as we discussed, it was a brutal struggle focused on the internal balance of power and religious settlement within the HRE.
So Germans fighting Germans mostly, but with outside help.
Largely, yes. This phase, the sources note, saw a significant attempt at resolution with the Peace of Prague in 1635. This treaty was largely an agreement between the emperor and many of the German states, aimed at resolving the internal religious and political issues that had fueled the conflict since 1618. It brought a temporary peace to many parts of the empire and saw some Protestant states, like Saxony, make peace with the emperor.
So another attempted peace. But what happened after the Peace of Prague in 1635 that kept the war going for another 13 years and escalated it further?
Yeah, it didn't hold, clearly.
The sources mark this as the major turning point in the war's nature. It's when France, led by Cardinal Richelieu, officially entered the war, forming an open alliance with Sweden, which had been involved since 1630.
France jumps in properly.
According to the material you provided, France's direct entry dramatically transformed the conflict. It shifted the primary focus away from being a purely internal German civil war, even with external involvement, and turned the Holy Roman Empire into the central theater for a larger, full-blown European struggle against France's main rivals, the Habsburgs, both the Austrian Emperor Ferdinand III, and crucially, Spain.
So it becomes France and Sweden versus Austria and Spain, fought out mainly in Germany.
That's the core of it, yes. France's motivation was largely strategic and geopolitical, surrounded by Habsburg territories, Spain to the south, Spanish Netherlands to the north, Franche-Comté to the east. France felt encircled and saw the war as an opportunity to break Habsburg power, secure its own borders, and establish French dominance in Europe.
Classic balance of power politics.
And their alliance with Sweden provided a powerful military partner already operating effectively within the empire.
A potent combination. And so the fighting continued for another 13 years, characterized by this major power struggle, finally concluding with the monumental Peace of Westphalia in 1648.
The famous Peace of Westphalia.
Right.
What did it actually do?
Well, the sources highlight the key outcomes. It didn't just end the 30 Years' War, it fundamentally restructured the political order of the Holy Roman Empire and, arguably, Europe. The terms included granting significantly greater autonomy to the individual states within the Holy Roman Empire.
More power to the princes.
Essentially, yes. Explicitly mentioning Bavaria and Saxony as examples whose increased independence was recognized and cemented. Crucially, the Peace of Westphalia also included Spain's official recognition of the independence of the Dutch Republic, finally bringing their own 80 Years' War to a formal close after 8 decades.
So Dutch independence finally confirmed. That's huge.
Absolutely. The legacy of the Peace of Westphalia and the 30 Years' War was profound, as the material underscores. The conflict and its resolution dramatically shifted the balance of power in favor of France.
France comes out on top.
Relatively speaking, yes. The long, exhausting struggle significantly weakened both branches of the Habsburgs. The Holy Roman Emperor's authority within the empire was curtailed by the increased autonomy of the states, and Spain's global power was diminished by its simultaneous wars and the loss of the Netherlands. This relative decline of the Habsburgs, combined with France's strategic victories and newfound alliances, positioned France for ascendancy.
Setting the stage for French dominance later.
Precisely. These sources state quite clearly that the war and the subsequent Peace of Westphalia prepared the ground for the expansionist wars and policies of King Louis XIV, who would dominate European politics for the next 60 years. It ushered in an era where France was the preeminent continental power.
Wow. So you can really see how all these threads we've discussed from the material weave together. You have the deep, unresolved religious divisions, smarked by the Reformation and left simmering by the limitations of the Peace of Augsburg. The inherently weak and fragmented political structure of the Holy Roman Empire, making unified action and conflict resolution incredibly difficult. Layer on top of that the complex, often competing interests of the powerful but divided Habsburg dynasty and the rise of more independent regional states within the empire. This created a highly unstable internal environment.
The internal fault lines.
Then that specific trigger event, the Bohemian Revolt and Frederick V's involvement in the strategically vital Palatinate, ignited the open conflict. The pre-existing network of interconnected European wars, like the Dutch Revolt, immediately drew in major powers.
The external connections.
And that crucial detail about external rulers holding imperial titles provided a direct justification for foreign intervention, rapidly escalating what might have been a localized revolt into a wider war within the empire. Finally, the entry of France and Sweden transformed it fully into a massive, continent-spanning struggle against Habsburg power, culminating in the Peace of Westphalia.
Which changed everything.
Which didn't just end the fighting, but fundamentally reshaped the political map and power dynamics of Europe, paving the way for the rise of France. It's a masterclass in how multiple complex factors converge to create catastrophe and ultimately transformation.
Exactly. It wasn't a single cause, was it? It was a dangerous convergence of religious strife, fundamental structural weaknesses in the empire, dynastic complexities, and the strategic ambitions of major European powers, all playing out in a turbulent landscape of interconnected conflicts. The Peace of Westphalia wasn't just a peace treaty, it was a reordering of the political system itself.
It really is, and we're so grateful to you for sending in these sources and prompting this deep dive. It's genuinely fascinating to trace these origins and see how those religious, structural, and political issues, combined with external rivalries, all contributed to something as devastating and transformative as the 30 Years' War.
It truly is. And if we connect this back to that concluding idea in the material about the shift in the balance of power and the increased autonomy granted to states like Bavaria and Saxony within the Holy Roman Empire, this raises a really significant question for you to consider, one that has long-term implications. By giving these individual principalities and states greater sovereignty and effectively weakening the central imperial authority, did the Peace of Westphalia inadvertently, or perhaps intentionally, set the fundamental stage for the Holy Roman Empire's eventual decline and its eventual dissolution?
Planting the seeds of its own end.
Perhaps. And in doing so, did it pave the way for the rise of the independent sovereign nation-state, where borders are clear and central governments hold authority within those borders as the dominant form of political organization in Europe? It's a powerful legacy of this conflict and something truly worth mulling over based on the groundwork these sources lay out.
A truly powerful question to leave you with. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the origins of the 30 Years' War. We look forward to seeing what sources you bring us for the next deep dive.